Hello, my dear unknown friends. Welcome back. I'm Inyotis Amicus. Today, I wish to read you another passage or another source in the Sources of Sophiurgy Series. Astrology, the Science of Wholeness by Wolfgang Smith. Wolfgang Smith graduated from Cornell at age 18 with majors in physics, mathematics, and philosophy. He subsequently contributed to a theoretical solution to the re-entry problem for spaceflight. After taking his doctorate in mathematics at Columbia, he served for 30 years as professor of mathematics at MIT, UCLA, and Oregon State University. Smith then devoted himself to correcting the fallacies of scientistic belief, focusing on foundational problems pertaining to quantum theory and visual perception by way of the tripartite cosmology. It needs, first of all, to be understood that the wholeness to which we allude is none other than the tripartite wholeness previously defined. See Chapter 2. Conceived in light of Platonist ontology, as we have seen, it can be depicted iconically in the form of a circle in which the center refers to the primary realm, not subject to the bounds of space or time, and the circumference represents what we know as the corporeal world. As for the interior of that iconic circle, it is indicative of a long-forgotten domain subject to time alone, which we refer to as the intermediary domain. What primarily confronts us is this tripartite ontology, or in this tripartite ontology, is thus a dichotomy between the supratemporal and the temporal realms, which is tantamount to the Platonist distinction between the intelligible and the sensible orders, followed by a division of the sensible into a gross or corporeal and a subtle or psychic stratum. The central claim of Platonism, which I deem to be definitive, can now be stated with astounding brevity. It affirms that the sensible derives its reality from the intelligible, to which it stands in principle as a signifier to its referent. And that ontological recognition, I contend, proves to be the master key to the enigma of astrology. To imagine that stars and planets, as currently conceived, affect human character and destiny is doubtless an absurdity. Yet, whatever the present-day aficionados of astrology may think in that regard, this is not what astrology actually affirms. It needs, first of all, to be understood that if the cosmos at large were, even remotely, what we nowadays take it to be, a conglomerate, namely of astrophysical entities scattered throughout the immensities of space made up of quantum particles, if that were in truth the case, astrology would indeed reduce to the exploded superstition it is generally taken to be. The point, however, is that the cosmos does not in truth reduce to the conceptions of our current astrophysics. If not even the simplest corporeal entity, a pebble, say, in the palm of my hand, reduces to an aggregate of quantum particles, what to speak of the cosmos at large? The key to the enigma of astrology, I have said, resides in the Platonist ontology. Nothing less than the high and perhaps, in a sense, esoteric teaching will suffice. It informs us that the reality of all things pertains ultimately to the intelligible realm, which entails that so long as stars and planets are conceived as spatio-temporal entities, they can ultimately be no more than signs pointing to an intelligible referent. Such causality, therefore, as enters into the purview of astrology, originates not in the stellar or planetary masses moving through space, but precisely in that supratemporal sphere Platonists refer to as the intelligible world. That causality, therefore, is not affected by a temporal transmission through space, the kind known to physics, to which I refer as horizontal, but proves to be what I call vertical causation, a kind that does not operate in time. The planets, as they sweep out the zodiac with its 12 constellations, may thus be likened to the hands of a cosmic clock announcing the seasons of the sensible world, which in truth they no more cause than the ticking of a clock can cause flowers to blossom and trees to bear fruit. Not only, however, is the cosmos tripartite in its integrality, but according to traditional doctrine, every ontological stratum reflects that tripartition on its own plane. What then constitutes the resultant tripartition of the corporeal world? It consists of the earth, as representing the corporeal, the planetary realm, the intermediary, and the stellar, the intelligible world. The spatiotemporal world proves thus to be an iconic representation of the tripartite cosmos, howbeit an inverted one inasmuch as it places the earth, representative of the lowest stratum, at the center. The fact is that the corporeal world, platonically conceived, constitutes a natural icon of the cosmos at large, the geocentric icon, one may call it, and it is upon this icon that astrology is based. It should, however, be recalled that the stars and planets as thus conceived do not by any means reduce to stars and planets as described by the physicist, which are subcorporeal, nor are these stars and planets, strictly speaking, perceptible. What we actually perceive when we look at a star or planet is, after all, no more than a spot of light which we take to be the star or planet. The aforesaid division of the corporeal world into its terrestrial, planetary, and stellar realms is not merely symbolic, as one tends nowadays to imagine, but real in a profoundly metaphysical sense. The corporeal world proves to be ontologically tripartite because it manifests, in a distinctly Platonist sense, the cosmic trichotomy itself. It must, in fact, do so by virtue of what it is, i.e., an image of the tripartite whole. And this ontological fact is vital. It is the reason ultimately why astrology is not, in truth, a superstition. But let me recall that this image is inverted, that the earth, though central, holds in truth the ontologically lowest rank, and I will note in passing that this geocentric icon constitutes actually the basis of the Ptolemaic cosmography, which has never been disproved, but merely discarded in post-Galilean times, when its ontological significance was no longer understood. This brings us to a third whole crucial to astrology, the one upon which, in fact, it is technically based. I am referring to what is termed a horoscope. One may think of it as a symbolic diagram representing the geocentric icon with its terrestrial center plus planetary and stellar spheres, as these present themselves to an observer at a particular time and terrestrial location. What counts is the position of the 7 astrological planets relative to each other, and to the 12 zodiacal signs. We shall not enter into the casting or reading of horoscopes, a subject well covered in any number of credible sources. Our objective is rather to indicate, in the broadest strokes possible, the ontological basis upon which astrological science rests. To this end, we first need, however, to complete the picture, for it happens that we have so far left out an additional wholeness which enters crucially into play, namely, our own. The decisive and long-forgotten fact is that in the integrality of their being, every man, woman, and child constitutes a veritable microcosm, a tripartite whole consisting of corpus, anima, and spiritus, which moreover is in a sense isomorphic to the macrocosm. This means that whatever astrological elements define the global structure of the universe, thereby rendering it a cosmos, have their counterpart in the microcosm, namely in us. Unbelievable as this surely appears to be from our atomizing point of view, whatsoever is definitive of the astrological cosmos, the planets Venus and Jupiter for instance, has its counterpart in the anthropos, the microcosm that we are. Of course, from a contemporary point of vantage, nothing could be more absurd. Suffice it to point out, however, that from a Platonist point of view, just the opposite holds true. The central fact that being derives from the intelligible order entails that every authentic wholeness cannot but replicate in its own inimitable way the very wholeness of the cosmos as it pre-exists on the intelligible plane. The reason why astrology is not a superstition resides finally in the well-nigh unbelievable fact that we carry the stars and planets within our integral being, to think of them as so many light years distance. That proves in the end to be the real superstition. The problem, however, is that only in terms of an inherently Platonist ontology can this be grasped. The Aristotelian already falls short in that regard. What to speak of the post-Galilean ontologies, which have in effect eliminated wholeness as such and ended up with a quantum dust that turns out in fine finale not to exist. The crucial point of the Platonist worldview resides in the fundamental dichotomy between the intelligible and the sensible realms, between a kind of being not subject to the conditions of time and space, and the time-conditioned modes terminating in the corporeal. What needs above all to be grasped is that corporeal entities derive such being as they have, not, most assuredly, from quantum particles, but from an intelligible referent in relation to which they serve as a sign, which is to say that in truth their reality is ultimately semantic, to use Jean Borel's term, and it is upon this semanticity, precisely, that the modus operandi of astrology is based. The reason, thus, why stars and planets can serve as signs is that, in the final count, they are precisely that. The tripartite constitution of the human microcosm testifies to its aviternity, its supratemporal nature, and hard as it may be for the contemporary mind to accept the time and place of our birth so far from being accidental, is actually indicative of who it is that has here and now entered the corporeal world, which is in fact precisely what the natal horoscope discloses in its own way. We have all become persuaded that there exists a stringent causation based upon the interaction of minute corporeal or subcorporeal parts, yet we balk generally at the very notion of a causality emanating from wholeness. And even when it has been proved that a mode of causation based upon parts does not suffice, cannot account, for instance, for the production of so-called complex specified information, we continue, as a rule, to deny that a causality based upon wholeness is so much more conceivable, or is so much as conceivable. Yet, the fact remains that this inconceivable causality of wholeness turns out to be the only kind that permits intelligence, morality, art, and in fact science itself to exist. Getting back to the natal horoscope, what else can it be than a representation, in the language of astrology to be sure, of the person in the wholeness of his being as identified by the time and place of his birth? And that very language is precious and irreplaceable, inasmuch as it is not contrived, not invented, but is based upon the true morphology of man, his authentic structure as the microcosm he is. One might go so far as to claim that one requires the language of astrology to perceive a person in the actuality of his being, which lies far deeper than his physical and psychological characteristics. Astrology deals with wholeness, we have said, and it can do so because its modus operandi is itself holistic as opposed to analytical. Of course, there are rules, for beginners or amateurs, one might say, to the effect that Jupiter in Gemini, say, is indicative of this or that, and no doubt dicta of that kind have their place. But they do not add up to what may rightly be termed the science of astrology, any more than textbook rules concerning scales, chords, and meters add up to a hearing of a sonata or a symphony. The point, once again, is that music, all authentic art for that matter, deals with wholes, which in fact do not reduce to the sum of their parts, and this fact is crucial, for otherwise one is dealing not in truth with a whole, but with a mere aggregate, which of course is precisely what our physical sciences are about. The name of the game is to decompose, to eliminate, in effect, whatever authentic wholeness may initially exist. But whereas these contemporary sciences prove thus to be inherently reductive, destructive that is, of authentic wholeness, such is by no means a sine qua non of science per se, which is to say that there do in fact exist bona fide sciences of a non-reductive kind. The point, however, is that these differ fundamentally from the reductive genre in their modus operandi, and bear moreover a qualitative significance over and above their quantitative content. It may come as a surprise that even pure mathematics admits such non-reductive modes, and in fact the earliest schools were concerned mainly with the qualitative aspects of arithmetical and geometric facts. Such is the case especially in the Pythagorean tradition, where a profound connection between mathematics and the arts, beginning with music and architecture, comes into view. That connection persisted, in fact, right up to the advent of modern times, which is to say that the contemporary reduction of mathematics to an abstract formalism and ultimately to set theory constitutes actually a post-Enlightenment phenomena. Before that time, a number was an integer or a ratio of such, which to this day is termed a rational number, and these numbers, so far from reducing to pure quantity, possessed a qualitative identity, a wholeness, namely, of which the mathematician of our days has no longer the ghost of an idea. To catch a glimpse of what stands at issue in these long-forgotten mathematical sciences, one may recall that, in the context of musical harmony, it is precisely a halftone that takes you from a major to a minor key, from the dynamic world of the sun, if you will, to the pensive sphere of the moon, its qualitative complement, a fact concerning which our contemporary understanding of mathematics can obviously tell us nothing at all. What I am driving at is that the same holds true for the natal horoscope, which has to do likewise with qualities and wholeness as opposed to quantities and parts. To be precise, it represents the person in the wholeness of his being as mirrored in the corresponding aspect of the cosmos, defined by the positions of the planets with respect to each other and the 12 zodiacal signs corresponding to the time and place of his birth. And this makes sense because a human being is himself a microcosm, a replica in miniature of the integral cosmos, one might say. The natal horoscope may thus be viewed as a description of a particular man or woman in terms based upon a universal wholeness which has been studied and codified by astrologers for thousands of years. And whereas this may seem irrational in a culture conditioned to view wholes as nothing more than an aggregate of parts, the picture changes drastically once it is realized, that the matter stands in truth just the other way around, that it is actually the whole that gives rise to its parts. It then makes perfect sense, moreover, to suppose that the wholeness of the microcosm contains within itself the virtually infinite ensemble of potential microcosmic wholes, as represented by attainable horoscopes. What this entails is that the panorama of human life is not simply haphazard, void of rhyme or reason, as one might say, but comports with a principle of order. But again, what stands at issue is not an order based upon parts, not a Laplacian determinism to be sure, but an order based upon wholeness, such as we encounter, for instance, in the spheres of music and art. The natal horoscope may thus be compared to the key of a musical composition that imposes a recognizable characteristic, which, however, enables rather than impedes freedom of expression. It is in truth that very wholeness expressed by the natal horoscope which enables creative activity as such, beginning, one might say, with the production of what Bill Dembski terms complex specified information, which of course is merely the quantitative imprint of what is thereby produced. In short, what we are and are able to accomplish as a human being is encoded in the natal horoscope. And let us note that the reading of that horoscope cannot ultimately be reduced to rules. Rules are there, of course, for the beginner and give one a start, but they are there to be transcended. The ultimate reading of a horoscope is like the hearing of a symphony. In the final count, wholeness speaks to wholeness alone. Let me note once more, however, that to the contemporary mind, which has all but forfeited the very idea of wholeness, all this has become incomprehensible and is consequently taken to be absurd. All such a mind is able to discern, be it in the cosmos at large or in a human being, is an accidental assemblage of parts precariously held together by the action of blind forces, and we can all agree that if such were the case, astrology would in truth reduce to an absurdity. It happens, however, that such is not the case. We have referred to astrology as the science of wholeness. It needs, however, to be understood that what interests the astrologer is that wholeness in both its macro and microcosmic manifestations, as distinguished from the causality connecting the two. We add nothing to astrological science by pointing out that it hinges upon vertical modes of causality. We only explain why the Encyclopedia Britannica refers to it as an exploded superstition. It is not the concern of the astrologer to understand the causal connection between a human microcosm and the cosmic macrocosm. His task is to read a horoscope, not to explain why it works. And this reading is as much an art as it is a science. The novice in astrology, to be sure, labors to apply its textbook rules as best he can, yet a master reads a horoscope very much the way a true musician reads a score. He hears the horoscope, one is tempted to say. Philosophically speaking, the fact that astrology is based exclusively upon vertical causation entails that it can only be understood in Platonist terms. The causal nexus between the microcosm and the macrocosm, as we have noted before, proves to be the kind that connects a sensible signifier to an intelligible referent, what Jean Borella characterizes as semantic. What ultimately validates astrological science reduces thus to the ontological fact that the reality of all that is sensible, be it macro or microcosmic, pertains to the intelligible order, where there is no more separation of parts, and where even opposites are subsumed in the unity of wholeness. So far, we have considered the reading of the natal horoscope. There is also, however, an astrology based upon two horoscopes, a natal, namely, and one corresponding to a later time, the objective. At least, as popularly conceived, being to elicit the influence of the stars and planets upon the life and prospects of the persons specified by the former at the time of the latter. Having previously noted that there is actually no such horizontal causation, it is evident that this second astrological scenario is likewise to be understood in terms of wholeness, which is, after all, what astrology is about. Yet regardless of the cause, the effect presents itself indeed as an influence of some kind. The point, however, is that it is we who respond to that influence. Our human freedom, our own wholeness thus, is in no wise abrogated or compromised. On the contrary, it is presented with an opportunity, as it were, to assert itself, in the fullness of its sovereignty no less, by way of its response. We need to understand that in the sphere of astrology we are dealing with whole acting upon whole, as opposed to parts acting upon parts. And this means, of course, that the action, too, is of a fundamentally different kind, vertical as distinguished from horizontal. It is to be noted that this indeterminacy, or better said, freedom, does not deprive the astrological prediction of times and seasons of its significance or utility, for the better we understand what it is that confronts us, the more enlightened and effective can be our response. Without such an understanding of what predictive astrology is actually about, on the other hand, the practice of peering into horoscopes may indeed prove harmful. As with every science, one needs to know what one is doing. And therein lies the quandary of astrology ever since the Enlightenment. It happens that the zeitgeist itself impedes us from understanding what that science is actually about. It may thus be a happy fault that most people in our day have bought into the exploded superstition narrative. It saves them from dabbling in matters they are bound to misconceive. Meanwhile, of course, astrology remains what it is. I am reminded of an incident in the life of Niels Bohr. He was taking a friend to a mountain cabin he owned when the visitor noticed a horseshoe mounted upright above the entrance. "Surely, Professor Bohr, you don't believe this can have an effect?" asked the visitor. "Of course I don't," replied the great physicist, "but they say it works whether you believe in it or not." Well, so does astrology, and despite the prevailing incomprehension on the part of scientists, there are notable exceptions even in that quarter. Let me cite at least one example, that of Johannes Kepler, the founder, if you will, of modern astronomy, and a confirmed heliocentrist, no less. Referring to astrology, he writes, quote, "More than 20 years of practice have convinced my rebellious spirit of its validity." In conclusion, I wish to point out that astrology and modern physics are actually related. They prove namely to be polar opposites. For whereas physics is the science at which one arrives by reducing the corporeal world to its so-called atomic or particulate constituents, astrology operates by an implicit reference to maximal wholeness. One completes the corporeal world, so to speak, in the tripartite wholeness of which it forms the lowest tier. This ontological reversal, moreover, entails a corresponding etiological shift from horizontal to vertical causality, namely, as we have noted. Physics and astrology constitute thus two opposite extremes, no vertical causality in the one and no horizontal causality in the other. Or to put it in ontological terms, on the one hand, a science based upon the sub-existential quantum world, and on the other, a science based on the supra-existential realm, Platonists refer to as the intelligible. We should not fail to point out, moreover, that there is yet a third categorical opposition between the two sciences, for whereas both are in a sense mathematical, the respective kinds of mathematics constitute once again diametrical opposites, a point touched upon earlier. And this proves to be crucially significant. We have forgotten that mathematics per se does not reduce to its post-Enlightenment genres, that there exists that there exist forms of mathematics tracing back at least to the Pythagorean tradition in which arithmetic and geometry are irreducibly separated, and numbers consist simply of integers and their ratios. What confronts us in this long-forgotten pre-Enlightenment mathematics is a science in which number does not reduce to sheer quantity, but remains a qualitative, one might actually say, an ontological significance. And as we have noted, that mathematics was in fact cultivated vigorously in the philosophical schools, particularly the Platonist, and is intimately connected with the arts, especially with music and architecture. It is the mathematics that speaks to us in the fugues of Johann Sebastian Bach and in the great cathedrals of Europe, the kind that inspired Jean Mignot to say, "Ars sine scientiae nihil." Art without science is nothing. My point is that astrology too rests upon a mathematics linked to the qualitative realm, as exemplified so strikingly in musical harmony, whereas we have noted a halftone can take you from the world of the sun to that of the moon. And who knows even what this means until he has heard it in the depth of his soul. If modern physics and astrology, the science of infinitesimal parts and the science of maximal wholeness, prove thus to be in every respect polar opposites, is it any wonder that in a physics-dominated civilization, astrology should not be held in high esteem? The fact, moreover, that this science of wholeness is incurably Platonist serves in itself to alienate the physicist, moored as he tends to be in a post-Galilean ontology which constitutes its very negation. It needs to be understood that the current relegation of astrology to the status of a pseudoscience, so far from being based on scientific evidence, rests squarely on pseudo-philosophical grounds, upon the very premises, namely, that define the zeitgeist of our time. Admittedly, philosophy, as an academic discipline, carries little weight these days, and hardly touches upon metaphysical issues anymore. Yet, in its capacity to close our eyes to the existence of higher spheres, its prowess remains undiminished since the epochal opus of Locke, Hume, and Kant. Finally, let it be noted that not only does astrology have a rational basis of the loftiest kind, as we have come to see, but it offers a service to humanity no other science is able to provide, a bona fide knowledge, namely, of who we are, for that is, after all, what, in its own way, the natal horoscope entails. In this regard, astrology fulfills a function which has nowadays been taken over by various contemporary schools of psychology, in a manner that is not only upside down, but dangerous in the extreme, as I have argued elsewhere. Astrology, finally, can open our eyes to the undiminished grandeur of the universe. The fact, first of all, that the latter is actually a cosmos, as distinguished from a helter-skelter of particles moving endlessly, meaninglessly, as Whitehead laments. Contrary to what our contemporary sciences lead us to believe, astrology teaches us that things exist, not in truth from the bottom up, but just the other way around, from the top down. It is not actually the parts that make the whole, but it is, in truth, the whole that makes the parts. As for myself, moreover, I harbor no doubt that the Weltanschauung upon which astrology is based, and which in turn it expresses, is not only true, but normative for mankind at large, that in fact it is consonant with the veritable Sophia that inspires and enables not only art, but human culture in all its higher modes, and ultimately permits us, Deo volente, to glimpse, as through a glass darkly, the unspeakably glorious calling and last end of human birth. If you enjoy this content, please feel free to like and subscribe. And maybe even hit the bell icon if you want to be notified of any future uploads. Thank you for joining me. Until next time, dear unknown friends.